Welcome to Crash Course Injury Law with Joe Ghabour.
Welcome back to Crash Course Injury Law with Joe Ghabour, founder of Ghabour Law. Joe is a personal injury attorney licensed in New Jersey, New York, and Florida who helps injured people understand how liability is evaluated and how different types of accident cases are handled. I'm Lisa Mosbey, your host, and today we're talking about bicycle accidents in New Jersey, including how right-of-way works, how fault is determined, and why these cases often involve more serious injuries than people expect. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Hi, Lisa. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so glad to be with you here talking about bicycle accidents because I'm a biker myself. Joe, when a bicycle accident happens in New Jersey, how is the case evaluated differently from a typical car accident claim?
Well, a bicycle case is not just a case involving a smaller version of a two-car crash, for example. In New Jersey, a cyclist riding on the roadway generally has the same rights and duties as a driver of a vehicle. So we still have to analyze traffic rules. We have to look at right-of-way. We have to look at lane positioning. We have to look at signaling and visibility. But bike cases also tend to involve a very different injury profile because the rider has no steel frame around him or her. There are no airbags. There's no seat belt protecting them. And on top of that, the insurance analysis can be much more complicated as well.
And you mentioned right of way. How do right of way rules apply different between drivers and cyclists, especially in situations like intersections, turns, or even shared roadways?
So, a big point is that when a cyclist is lawfully riding on the road, the cyclist is considered traffic. So, at intersections, the same core right of way rules matter. A vehicle already in the intersection generally has priority. A driver on the left must yield to a vehicle on the right when they arrive at about the same time. And the driver making a left turn has to yield to oncoming traffic that is close enough to be an immediate hazard. That includes an oncoming bicyclist. A nuance people often miss is crosswalk law. Under New Jersey's pedestrian statutes, a person riding a bicycle is not treated the same way as a person on foot. So whether the cyclist was riding through a crossing or walking the bike can greatly affect the right-of-way rules that apply.
And then, what are some of the most common accident scenarios that you see involving bicycles? And how is fault usually analyzed in those situations?
The most common scenarios are intersection and driveway crashes. Um, right hook collisions where a vehicle turns across the cyclist's path, a left turn crash where a driver cuts in front of an oncoming cyclist, and overtaking cases where the motorist passes too closely or misjudges the rider's position. Believe it or not, more than 70% of car bicycle crashes happen at driveways or at intersections, which line up with what we see in litigation. Fault usually comes down to a very specific set of questions. Who had the right of way? Who made the last safe observation? Did the driver signal and wait until the turn could be made safely? Did the cyclist ride with the flow of traffic? Did the cyclist stay visible and follow the applicable control devices, whether it's a traffic light or a stop sign? And in driveway cases, for example, a driver emerging from private property has a duty to stop and yield to traffic on the roadway that creates an immediate hazard. So these cases often turn on timing, sight lines, speed, and whether either side violated a specific traffic rule in the seconds before the impact.
And Joe, if both the cyclist and the driver share some level of responsibility, how does that affect the outcome of the case under New Jersey law?
Well, it's just the same as in any other negligence case in New Jersey. There's comparative negligence. The jury assigns percentages of fault that total 100%. If the injured cyclist is 50% or less at fault, the cyclist can still recover damages, but the award will get reduced by the percentage of fault attributable to the cyclist. If the cyclist is more than 50% at fault, then the cyclist will be unable to recover as recovery is barred altogether.
I often find that very confusing, so thank you for clearing that up. These cases often involve more severe injuries. How does that impact how the case is built and valued from early on?
Well, it really changes everything early on. If when you're looking at these cases, you have to evaluate them with a different eye. Because cyclists are exposed, these cases disproportionately involve displaced fractures, often head injuries, facial traumas, significant scarring. We see shoulder injuries, knee injuries, and sometimes we see permanent orthopedic or neurological complaints. So, from the very beginning, we are thinking not just about the emergency room records, but we're also thinking about imaging, specialists, rehab. Very important, we start thinking about future medical treatment that the person will require. We also look at lost earnings and their capacity to earn in the future. And of course, we have to look and evaluate the long term effect on daily function.
And then what challenges come up when gathering evidence in bicycle accident cases, especially compared to standard vehicle collisions?
Evidence is often harder to preserve in bicycle cases. The cyclist may be badly hurt and unable to give a statement, to photograph the scene, to identify witnesses, or document what the other driver said. The bicycle itself may get moved quickly. Nearby cameras may overwrite within days. And a lot of these crashes happen at intersections or driveways where the key evidence is fleeting, such as signal timing, traffic flow, observations, skid marks, debris, and short lived surveillance footage.
Then how do insurance issues play out in these cases, particularly when the cyclist doesn't have a traditional auto policy?
Well, this is where bicycle cases can surprise people. People are often surprised that under no fault, if they are injured in a car accident, that their own insurance policy will pay for their medical bills. Well, the same thing really happens for bicycle cases. Um, Even if the injured person was on a bicycle rather than in a car, auto insurance is still going to be central to the claim. Under New Jersey's no fault structure, personal injury protection, or PIP for short, the benefits are there in the standard automobile policy, and they will cover the named insured and resident family relatives in certain circumstances, including when they are injured as pedestrians or bicyclists. The New Jersey Supreme Court has discussed that bicyclists have historically been treated as pedestrians for purposes of the No Fault Act. So, one of the first questions we ask is whether there is any automobile insurance available. A lot of times we get looked at like we have two heads. Why do you need to know about auto insurance? I was riding a bicycle. We have to know about auto insurance because your auto insurance at home will cover the medical expenses if you are involved in a bicycle accident. Now, if you are injured in a bicycle accident in New Jersey and you do not have an automobile insurance policy because you do not have a car and you do not live with any resident relative who has a car, then we would have to file it through the state's program. New Jersey PLIGA, it's a program that every insurance policy pays into a little bit when you come to renew. And that covers people that do not have a vehicle, that do not live with anyone that has a vehicle and is insured under an automobile policy, and they will provide up to $250,000 in personal injury protection, subject to a $250 deductible and a $950 copay of the first $5,000 in medical bills. So even if you're involved in a bicycle accident and you do not have auto insurance, there is still coverage to make sure that you are treated and that you get the best possible care that you need.
And then, Joe, what specific factors tend to make bicycle accident cases more complex from a legal and practical standpoint?
Well, there are really several legal frameworks operating at once. The on the road rule side that the cyclist is generally treated like a vehicle operator, have to follow the traffic laws. But on the insurance side, the analysis will turn to no fault, and who pays for the medical expenses, and also if the defendant driver doesn't have enough automobile insurance to cover the damages, then we have a situation where there is underinsured motorist coverage. In situations where the driver does not have any insurance or has the basic dollar-a-day policies that are available in New Jersey, then the uninsured motorist coverage will come into play. These things are not readily obvious to non-lawyers. On the damages side, we also have to deal with threshold issues, whether there are injuries sufficient for the plaintiff to be able to get compensation. We have to deal with permanencies, whether the injuries are permanent. And with much more serious injuries, we have to deal with the entire, manner of how this person is going to move on with his or her life. Is that person going to be able to work in the future? Is that person going to have serious neurological or orthopedic deficits going forward? So there's a lot of things that go into it that are not readily recognizable to a non-lawyer who doesn't practice in this area of law, obviously. And on the liability side, we always have to evaluate comparative negligence. Was the driver fully at fault, or was the bicyclist also at fault to a certain percentage?
And as these cases move forward, what tends to have the biggest influence on how they ultimately resolve?
Well, in my opinion, I believe there are four things that drive the outcome of a case. The first thing is obviously how clear the liability is. The second thing we have to look at is if there's any comparative negligence exposure. Did the cyclist do something wrong? The third thing we have to look at is how the injuries are documented. And I say the injuries are documented because a person could be injured but doesn't get any treatment. Therefore, those injuries do not get documented and do not really factor into the case. So an injured cyclist has to get treatment and has to make sure that the injuries are properly documented, especially if there is fracturing, scarring, any permanent impairment of the sort. And fourth, how much insurance is actually available? The clearer the liability, the more extensive the damages, the more likely the case will resolve. And obviously, the flip side of that is if the liability is iffy and there's not much damage, then the chances of the case resolving short of trial is very low. And I also want to point out something else, which is very important. New Jersey has recently distinguished between a bicyclist and a person who is driving an electrical bicycle, an e-bike. Under a recent Supreme Court ruling in New Jersey, there is no personal injury protection coverage available to a bicyclist who is driving an e-bike or an electric scooter. Those do not fall under the personal injury protection guidelines, and the Supreme Court ruled that those types of accidents will have to find coverage somewhere else or have their own coverage because the automobile PIP coverage will not come into play. And that's something that most people do not know about. It is something that they need to keep in mind when they're driving e-bikes or e-scooters because they go faster, the injuries are usually more severe, and now you have to add a layer of complexity to it that there's no insurance from your automobile to cover the injuries.
Thank you so much for your insight and guidance. This was very informative for me, and I'm sure for the audience as well. That's it for today's episode of Crash Course Injury Law with Joe Ghabour. If you'd like to learn more about your rights after a bicycle accident or speak with Joe and his team, visit ghabourlaw.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like, leave a review, and subscribe to the show so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you there.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.